On Press Perspective today, we touch upon the outlook shared by high-level U.S. military officials on South Korea's potential role in promoting regional security and stability. Hello and welcome. It's Wednesday, November 19th here in Seoul, and you're watching Press Perspective. I'm Min Sunhee. South Korea's potential role in regional peace and security has been highlighted by top U.S. military officials in recent days. Now, today we touch upon what has been said and what they mean. For more on this, I have Thomas Maresca with United Press International here in the studio. Thomas, welcome back.
Thanks. Great to be here.
I also have Peter Lee, a research fellow at the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. Peter, Dr. Lee, it's great to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
Right, we shall start here in the studio. Thomas, as I mentioned earlier, quite a number of top U.S. military officials in recent days have been highlighting South Korea's potential role in promoting regional stability. Let's start off with the remarks by the Chief of U.S. Naval Operations.
Right, so this was Admiral Daryl Caudle, as you said, the Chief of U.S. Naval Operations, and he's been in South Korea and as part of an Asia trip over the past, week, 10 days, and he made some remarks in Seoul on Friday that were basically referencing South Korea's future potential nuclear-powered submarines, and this was right after this fact sheet had come out outlining, the U.S. approval of Seoul being able to build and perhaps source fuel for these nuclear submarines, and so Admiral Caudle basically said that, using these submarines to perhaps counter China would be a natural expectation, was the quote, given the capability that these vessels have. And, he even invoked Spider-Man, the film, with this phrase, with great power comes great responsibility, and was saying pretty much outright that, South Korea would sort of shift away from being a regional navy to a global navy with the power of these subs, and kind of framed it as this responsibility. And so this is representing this shift in how Washington is looking at the U.S.-South Korea alliance. And we've heard there's been many voices talking about this and this kind of sense of alliance modernization, and South Korea taking on both more of its own sort of responsibility at home, as well as perhaps shifting some of its resources and perhaps shifting some of the U.S. troops based here towards more regional objectives or potential threats, especially, and Caudle mentioned this as well, regarding China, which the U.S. frequently calls its so-called pacing threat. And so, I think we're seeing some outlines where there's obviously some of this is in both sides' interests. We do know that Seoul has wanted to acquire these nuclear-powered submarines for quite a long time. And, this is a step for South Korea, generally speaking, to perhaps gain, wartime operational control of its troops, which has also long been a goal. But, at the same time, there is some tension where South Korea mostly has framed some of these developments as being an eye more towards North Korea, in particular, responding to North Korea's developments. So, and I think Lee Jae Myung has certainly mentioned the threat of China as well. But, I think generally speaking, there seems to be kind of a perspective from some analysts where this is a point where, how far does the push and pull go with Seoul kind of, fully getting on board with Washington's focus on China. And we're already seeing, there's some questions too about where even these vessels are going to be built. There's some kind of, we still don't know all the details about that. And then, we've seen already China has voiced its concerns about these nuclear subs. The Chinese ambassador said, if there is, quote, if there's a change in the strategic purpose of the South Korea-U.S. alliance, China's perspective toward the alliance would also change. So, South Korea has to obviously keep that factor in mind as well. So, this is one of the areas that we're seeing this developing process.
Right, those concerns by the Chinese ambassador here in South Korea, Dai Bing, coming on last week, of course, just before the release of the fact sheet. Peter, pundits here in South Korea say what perhaps startled them even more than the request for nuclear-powered submarines by the president was his reasoning. Now, the president spoke of restrictions in South Korea's ability, and I'm quoting, to track North Korean and Chinese vessels. What are your thoughts regarding his remarks?
So I think Thomas gave a really good sort of overview of how the two issues, North Korea and China, have fit into this debate. But I think President Lee Jae Myung, he took a calculated gamble in terms of mentioning China as a possible justification for why South Korea should be given access to this nuclear-propelled submarine technology. It's worth recalling that the United States has never shared this other than with the United Kingdom in the 1950s and more recently with Australia as part of the AUKUS partnership. So it's really an unprecedented decision by the United States. And if you think back the last 20 years or so, South Korea has floated the idea of acquiring a nuclear-powered submarine capability under both progressive and conservative governments. And usually that motivation has been about North Korea. And the United States has not found that sufficient or sufficiently compelling to grant that transfer. And so by President Lee Jae Myung mentioning that it's not just about North Korea, it's not just about the Korean Peninsula, but actually it's about South Korea's contributions to the United States and US alliance strategy in the broader region, I think that was far more compelling. And so that was a calculated risk because progressive governments especially, but South Korean governments more broadly, have generally been very reticent about mentioning explicitly China as a strategic target for their military buildup, for their military strategy in the region. And so I think President Lee Jae Myung had made a calculated gamble in that sense.
Right, and hence the response from quite a number of pundits here in the country. Thomas, moving forward, the commander of U.S. Forces Korea has stressed the strategic positioning of South Korea for regional security. Could you tell us more about his observations and their broader implications?
Yeah, so this is, kind of in the same context of some of these other, topics about the alliance that have been floating around. And this was Commander of U.S. Forces Korea, General Xavier Brunson, and he recently had promoted this idea of, they're calling it the East Up mapping, which is, taking a map and turning, rather than north being the top, turning it and making the east be the top, and, looking at it that way, he is saying that you see that the three American allies in the Indo-Pacific, and he's saying South Korea, Japan, and the Philippines, create a sort of strategic triangle for regional security. And so he's trying to kind of frame this as these alliances shouldn't be seen as isolated bilateral relationships between Washington and each country, but as kind of the sides of a triangle working together. And he talked about how each country has equipped with unique capabilities, Korea's central kind of depth, Japan's technological advantage and maritime reach, Philippines' access to these key southern sea lanes. And he really was focusing kind of on how Korea is in the middle of this. He said that Korea acts as kind of a natural pivot, and he pointed out that Camp Humphreys, where the USFK is based, is around 160 miles, he's using miles, from Pyongyang, 610 miles from Beijing, and 500 miles from Vladivostok. So it's, positioned to address northern threats even from Russia, as well as, providing a Western reach against Chinese activities. And so, this definitely is just a part of this. It's kind of spelling out maybe a bit more this strategic flexibility debate that's been going on, and whether, the 28,500 or so U.S. troops stationed here could possibly be deployed beyond the peninsula, including potentially, the Taiwan contingency has come up as a factor. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth was here recently, and he also kind of suggested flexibility for regional contingencies is something that, the two sides would take a look at. And again, it's I think it's opportunities and risks again for South Korea. It is raising Seoul's strategic importance, beyond just the peninsula. But again, you risk entangling Korea in this deeper kind of, U.S.-China competition, which, Peter sort of spelled out some of the Seoul's perspective on how to navigate this, and I think it's obviously, I would just add that, nowadays, certainly the alliance still seems strong, but, with the Trump administration in particular, focusing on this kind of America First perspective on everything as an overarching kind of position, and, the idea that these relationships are a little bit more transactional than perhaps, they have been in the past. You have to factor that in. I think most allies are also trying to figure out what does that mean for us. And, for South Korea, you can't just kind of ignore China, as a neighbor, as an economic partner, just not only as a sort of military potential, threat, but just obviously as a super important economic partner. So again, it's something that South Korea has a lot of sort of calculating to try and work out.
Right. Peter, I'm going to pick up from where Thomas just left off then. The South Korea joint document, that was the South Korea-US joint document that was disclosed late last week, details, and I'm quoting, the importance of preserving peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait and opposes unilateral changes to the status quo. What would be the ripple effects of a hostile confrontation between China and Taiwan for South Korea, keeping in mind, of course, its alliance with the US, Peter?
So I think it's worth keeping in mind that this is not the first time that Korea and the United States have mentioned peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. So if we go back, the first time that was mentioned in recent years was in 2021 under the progressive Moon Jae-in administration with the Biden administration. And so that language is basically, verbatim. We've seen that reappear over the years, even under conservatives as well. If you think back 2 years ago to the Camp David trilateral with Korea, Japan, and the US, that went even further. And then, for instance, it mentioned peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait as an indispensable element of security and prosperity in the international community. So that's quite robust language. I think more fundamentally, the point is that Korea clearly has a stake in ensuring peace and stability in that conflict. It's not to say that Korea is going to be involved in that conflict or that Korea wants to escalate or increase tensions, right? It's Korea opposes the use of unilateral force by China. And I think it reflects, part of the submarine discussion that we were having earlier, right? The United States clearly is concerned that the People's Republic of China has taken actions in the last few years and months that really have raised concerns about what it intends to do and potentially upset the status quo in the Taiwan Strait. And so I think that is the broader context within which Korea and the United States have really put this out there. President Lee Jae Myung mentioning that these submarines would be involved in Taiwan, in tracking Chinese submarines, for instance. I think that's part of the context as well. I think if you look at the joint fact sheet, there are other elements there that we see that Korea and the United States are thinking more broadly, right? Taiwan, but also into the broader Indo-Pacific region. And so, for instance, the fact sheet mentions they want to enhance conventional U.S. deterrence posture against all regional threats to the alliance, including North Korea. And so, it's open to interpretation of what all regional threats are. But I think that is the context within which we should see this Taiwan Strait reference. It's not something new. I don't think it's completely escalatory, but I think there are ripple effects. And just going back, Korea is a maritime trading nation. It is not immune for what happens in other parts of the region, whether that's the Taiwan Strait, whether that's the South China Sea. Korea has direct national interests and economic interests in these areas where China is clearly escalating tensions. And so I think Korea is saying very clearly that it wants these disputes to be resolved peacefully and through negotiation rather than through the use of force.
Right. Meanwhile, with regard to tensions over Taiwan, Thomas, a related dispute between Japan and China appears to have led to travel warnings and movie postponements. Do tell us about how this diplomatic dispute started and where does it stand right now?
Right. So yeah, this has really been roiling the news in Japan and around the region. But it basically started when Prime Minister Takaichi told Japan's parliament this was on November 7th, that a Chinese attack on Taiwan would count as a, quote, situation threatening Japan's survival and could trigger a military response from Tokyo. And, this is something that, Japanese leaders have kind of talked around this issue, but the idea of actually explicitly sort of mentioning military intervention is something previous prime ministers have not done, as far as I know. And China responded quite vigorously. It really felt like it was this bringing back this wolf warrior diplomacy that we've seen, in recent years from China, this kind of aggressive rhetoric, and I think South Korea has experienced some of that as well. But one thing that kicked it off was China's consul general in Osaka tweeted out saying that in response to Takeichi's comments that the dirty neck that sticks itself in must be cut off. A very violent image, and that kind of triggered some back and forth responses. But China's a lot of commentary in Chinese state-run media was attacking Japan over this comment, and China issued a travel warning advising its citizens to refrain from visiting Japan. Major Chinese airlines said they were offering refunds and changes on tickets to Japan, and there's just been kind of a constant, day by day, little other segments. On Sunday, the Chinese Ministry of Education warned citizens to exercise caution when making plans to study in Japan, citing a worsening public security situation and warning that there were crimes targeting Chinese nationals. Chinese Ministry of Defense on Friday said that Japan would suffer a crushing defeat if it dared to intervene. As you mentioned, Chinese film distributors suspended the release of a couple of Japanese anime films. And it's kind of this, basically it's a playbook that we've seen China use elsewhere, including to South Korea to some extent, this economic coercion. And it's sort of, at the moment, it's areas that are not sort of fundamentally could it's not a trade war in the sense that China's necessarily could be harmed from it, but it's picking segments that could impact Japan. If it's travelers not going there, it's something 7.5 million travelers from China visited Japan between January and September, which is the highest amount from any country. There's even been more. I think even today, China notified Tokyo of suspension of seafood imports. So, and the Chinese Premier Li Chang said, I guess that he has no plans to meet Takeichi at this week's G20 summit. So they're not backing down at all. At the same time, Takeichi and Tokyo has also sort of played it down, saying it was more theoretical comments. The foreign minister, Motegi, said there's no reason to apologize. So, for Takeichi too, she kind of came to power on this more stridently nationalist, position. So she's not someone who, necessarily would want to seem, to back down. So I think at the moment, it just feels like it's not going anywhere. It's kind of tense. It hasn't been, a major, it's like cut here or cut there. It could have a real impact on Japan. I mean, Japan could feel some of the economic impact of it, but it hasn't raised to the level of, say, like rare earth export controls, which China sort of pulled out when it was in the trade negotiations with Washington. So there's more cards that China could play if they want to take this to another stage. So, but right now, yeah, it feels like this could last for a while, and it is kind of the return of this aggressive sort of Chinese stance using economic coercion at its disposal.
Right. Peter, do you fear a similar spat perhaps between South Korea and China going forward? I mean, how should South Korea, generally speaking, seek to navigate regional geopolitical tensions, do you think?
I mean, so Thomas mentioned the playbook, right? I mean, and China's been running this playbook for nearly 20 years now, and using, economic coercion and threats and wolf warrior diplomacy to really intimidate, any country that is seen as encroaching on China's interests. The irony is that it's backfired spectacularly over the last 20 years, right? There are very few countries that have, after experiencing coercion, been more subsequent to China. And so, South Korea's own case, since the 2016, 2017, THAAD missile defense deployment, Korea has been on the receiving end of Chinese economic coercion for the better part of almost a decade now. And, only recently, even at the APEC summit, the last of the Chinese sanctions and coercion were being lifted. So it's been almost a decade. Now, has that changed South Korea's thinking or logic? I don't think so. So in that sense, China's approach to try to intimidate these countries, for even slight, mishaps, I think has not really been very effective. As for how this affects South Korea, I think, the nature of the relationship with China has changed significantly over that decade since the THAAD crisis. And so South Korea is, I think, far more resilient against potential Chinese coercion in the same way that they would try to do what they're doing against Japan right now. South Korea's economic relations, and even President Lee Jae Myung, when he was in Washington in August, he mentioned very clearly in a think tank conference that the old logic doesn't apply of Korea seeking security with the United States and economic prosperity with China. And I think the trade flows, the decoupling, the de-risking that has taken place in that time means that Korea has far more immunity from potential Chinese efforts to coerce South Korea.
Right, and in the meantime, South Korea, Thomas, has proposed military talks with North Korea. Could you give us some context behind this proposal, and what are the chances of such cross-border communication, do you think?
Right, so this was on Monday. South Korea's Deputy Defense Minister Kim Hong-chol officially proposed military talks with North Korea to clarify the military demarcation line and in an effort to prevent accidental armed conflict. And this is basically in the context of South Korea's military several times, this year and in recent years has fired warning shots to repel, North Korean troops that have violated the border, the military demarcation line, kind of within the DMZ. Pretty much since North Korea started to go back to that area, and they've been doing a lot of work there, rebuilding fences, putting guard posts back up, and so there's been a number of times when they've crossed into South Korean territory, and the South has fired warning shots and sort of warned them to run back, and I think. The defense minister said there was about 10 times this year alone this has already happened, and including there's an incident where North Korean soldiers crossed over while chasing a defector. But the Seoul basically, and has said this usually in each time they've fired these warning shots that. It seems accidental for the most part where the North Koreans are crossing over, and there is this sense of, both sides don't know exactly where the border really is. A lot of these military demarcation line posts that were put up at the end of the Korean War are not there anymore. So they're just hard to know where. So basically, it's a sensible kind of thing to reach out, but I think the chances of there being a response from North Korea seem quite slim. I mean, they haven't responded to anything that the South has attempted as far as restarting inter-Korean dialogue, as much as President Lee Jae Myung has made that a goal. For now, it doesn't seem like there's any kind of particular reason to expect them to respond, but it's another thing out there on the table. And with the sort of Trump factor floating around, where maybe we'll see a summit between Trump and Kim Jong-un, this could perhaps sort of work its way into that context. But yeah, that's where it is, I think. Now.
Right. There's been a bit of talk about a potential talk between President Trump and Kim Jong-un, perhaps next year in China when China hosts the APEC meeting, of course. All right, I'm afraid that's all the time we have. Thomas, as always, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you.
And Peter, Dr. Lee over at Asan Institute for Policy Studies, thank you very much for your insights today.
Thanks for having me, Sunny.
Right, and that is all the time we have for this edition of Press Perspective. As always, thank you for watching.